Hello, everyone. My name is Francesco Leoni. I'm a research fellow at Politecnico di Milano at the Department of Design. I am presenting today my contribution for the Data for Policy conference, and submission is number 6120. The title is What Makes the Data for Policy Discourse Different? Analyzing themes and topics of the data for policy field. The research I'm presenting today has been conducted as part of my doctoral research on data for policy, which I have now concluded, and that occupied me for the last 4 years. The research intended to focus on the use of data for policymaking through a design perspective. And as part of that work, it seems relevant to me to try to understand what makes the data for policy discourse different from any other discourse which is emerging in the space of discussing data-driven innovation for policymaking. Also, given that the use of data for policy has been increasingly addressed in recent European National Strategy for Data and Interoperability, and also given that in the research about digital government, there seems to be a shift during the last decades from ICT-centric toward data-centric focus. On that premise, the research has crafted its goal from few hypotheses. One hypothesis is that data for policy constitutes an autonomous field. I must clarify from the beginning of this presentation that with data for policy here, I'm referring not only to the Data for Policy conference, but to the broader conversation which is happening internationally and is discussing data-driven innovation specifically in relation with policymaking. And the researchers focus exactly on that type of discourse. And it's relevant, has been relevant in my opinion, to focus on that discourse because in the future, data-driven innovation for policymaking might be influenced by the surrounding system of knowledge production and research and practice, which is addressing the role of data in policymaking. So on this hypothesis, the research question has been focused on understanding what makes the data for policy discourse characteristic, what makes it different from other research strands, and what are the themes and topics that its communities prioritize. The theoretical perspective to propose that data for policy constitutes an autonomous field has been Bourdieu field theory. Bourdieu has been a very important sociologist, as many of you certainly know, which has developed in the 60s a theory which was used for understanding the practice of cultural production. In Bourdieu, the point of this theory was to highlight what is the interplay between individual agency and the dynamics of power and positionality which is existing in cultural milieux, meaning how the individual is behaving within a space of knowledge production or practice, and what is the influence that happens between these two. What was relevant in my own research was to have a theory that can allow me to say that possibly data for policy as a field is struggling for autonomy, as is struggling to emerge as a separate discourse within the broader debate of data-driven innovation. Again, I should underline the fact that when I refer about the field of data for policy, I do not intend necessarily and only the conference. In my view, in my research, the conference is one proxy, is one community within a broader conversation which is happening worldwide and which is discussing data-driven innovation in relation to policymaking. To address my research goals, I use a methodology which mixed together three main methods. The first one was a narrative literature review, meaning a literature review which has not been systematic, but has found through its own criterion, papers which were discussing data-driven innovation in relation to policymaking. Then I have used coding on a body of literature to operate a literature analysis. And in this case, I have used Data for Policy Conference and the papers published in the conference as a body of knowledge in which I could find topics relevant for my research. And the same coding was also applied to expert interview, which I developed in a certain moment in my PhD. And these two, the topics emerging from these two methods were matched together, and then also matched with the topics in the narrative literature review, in order to have a triangulation and find which were the meaningful themes across these three sources of data that I had. So the first method allowed me to find several topics of interest which seems to be specific in the discourse of data-driven innovation in policymaking. And again, this is the results coming from the first method applied to a series of papers that I selected, which discussed data-driven innovation in policymaking. These topics of interest are data governance, data culture, data science and analytics, data quality, privacy, data ethics, and these were the topic of interest. And also in this body of authors that I reviewed, several pressing themes, or so to say, a relevant insight seems to emerge. The four I'm presenting here are the importance that data quality has, given that in data-driven innovation applied to policymaking, one relevant thing is to apply non-traditional data in a process of policymaking. Therefore, data quality is often referred as one of the most important things. Also, one pressing somehow issue reported by the literature was a lack of empirical cases. Apparently, the few cases which is emerging in this space appear to be experimental and not going much further than that. And this also sometimes is the fault seems to be, the blame seems to be also on a limit of current theoretical frameworks, which is reported by in literature, to understand data-driven innovation in relation to policymaking. Another very interesting element that emerged, in my opinion, was the specific nature of policymaking, meaning that oftentimes when authors talks about data-driven innovation in policymaking, they make clear that applying data in policymaking needs to be done with awareness that policymaking constitutes a specific decision-making process, which has its own way to address evidence, and that includes also data, but also has its own dimension. So a second method I use to understand the discourse on the field of data for policy was a qualitative interview with experts. Experts were selected by me mainly by their involvement, by isolating them through their involvement in the Data for Policy conference. So the people that I interview were considered expert, mostly because they have a positionality within the Data for Policy conference. Although that doesn't apply to all the people I interview, that was a primary criterion for including them, because of course it would have been complicated otherwise to understand who is an expert in a field which is evolving. So the affiliation with the conference was one criteria. And I individuated 9 profiles, mostly were academics, independent researchers, and 3 profiles work in the public sector or international governmental organization. So they had another background. 8 profiles were in Europe and 1 profile was in Australia. So mostly we can say this sampling refers to Europe. And the teams that emerged from the interviews were several. They were very dense conversations, so I had to use coding in order to isolate what were the main insights. One important theme was that for them, data for policy could be referred as a field, but not completely. And I will come back to that later on. It was very important in their perception, the fact that political factors have on data, or the use of data for policymaking. So politics and political driver, all the interviews agreed were important element in data for policy as a field to be taken into account. And that also has to do with the nature of evidence in policymaking and the fact that evidence is often not to be considered the only source of the only input to decision making in policy. Other factors plays a role, and they all agreed also on mostly agree on the 3 important aspects that are specific in data for policy in their view, which are data literacy, data culture, and data ethics. Moving on with the other methods used, I have been conducting a literature analysis, and I've been using the Data for Policy conference proceeding, which has been published from the beginning of the conference to the last edition, 2021. This amounts to 146 papers in which I have performed the coding. So I try to consider for each paper, by looking at the title, the abstract, and the keywords, which codes could be the one describing better that paper and making clear what the paper is about. This resulted in having 225 codes that identify the topic in this body of literature. And as you can see, for example, here, I have found in the second column several codes which to me were equal to specific topics. And then the approach was, for example, for this particular group, to understand if they were referring to the same theme. So in this case, for example, all the topics here to me were could be considered close to the data governance topic. And then I counted the codes in order to understand for if that group would be more or less relevant than other groups. And at the end, I have several groups of teams. There was one big group of referring to specific topic, technologies, and application, which with my knowledge I could not divide. So each topic was left separate. And then moving on, there was topics which I could group together, and the biggest group, or the biggest second group, was one referring to privacy and data ethics. I put these two together because in the paper they are often considered as part of the same ethical approach to using data in policy. Another big group was about data, sources and types. So many people were discussing specific sources and types of data and their use in different settings. And therefore, this constituted another group. And moving on, there was also one group I could connect all the topics in a team close to policymaking. Okay, I call it policy related. So all these topics relate somehow to policy problems, policy tools, policy specific policy ideas, and so on and so forth. And then there was other two groups, data culture, data governance, and then analytics and modeling, citizen engagement and participation, artificial intelligence and machine learning, and data science and analytics. After having isolated topics throughout the three methods that I explained before, I try to match, we can call it triangulation. I try to match the topics across the three streams of data that I had. And two were the topics shared across the three methods. One was data culture, and with that I refer to the value given to data within the public sector. So what the culture about using data, the importance given to that. And the other is data ethics, which is about, of course, the ethical use of data in the public sphere. So these two topics seems to be shared across the three stream of research that I have developed, while the other are only partly shared, or totally unshared because they might be mentioned only in expert interview, but you don't find them in the literature analysis that I developed. So the main insights emerging from this work is, as I said, that data ethics and data culture appears to be central in the data for policy discourse. This suggests that this discourse is characterized by a normative and political dimension and orientation which possibly overshadow technical and technological aspects that might be more relevant at the same time in other fields. At the same time, about what emerged about the autonomous aspect of data for policy as a field is that possibly the field is yet developing as an autonomous field. This particularly was addressed in the conversation with the expert, where they considered that maybe data for policy is not something completely new or different from past discussion, for example, about the use of evidence in government. But at the same time, when we consider that data for policy discourse is dealing with policy making, that makes all the difference. And that may be the characterizing aspect of this field, given that policy making, as said many times before, has a specific nature, as a public decision-making process and intervention. And so, especially from the expert interview, there seems to be a mixed report about the autonomous aspect of data for policy as a field. If then data for policy as a field is characterized by policy making and all the specificities that come with that, at the same time, there seems to be a little discussion about policy and much discussion about data and technology and technological application. And despite a few examples, for example, the paper of Justin Longo that was presented in 2017 at the Data for Policy Conference, there's no much discussion about, there seems to be not much discussion about policy ideas, policy framework, and this might be problematic given that policy is exactly an aspect that characterizes the discussion. Also, at the same time, there seems to be a lot of interest in citizen participation and engagement, which mostly emerged from the literature analysis of the proceedings of the Data for Policy Conference. Looking forward, what this research has tried to suggest and will suggest to the future work in data for policy is the need of a clearer theorization and connection between the practice of using data in public sector and policy making, which will allow to have a better understanding of what data for policy as taken as object of inquiry. It would be useful, more very practically, to start the construction of a repository of case studies in order to have a clear understanding about what we mean by using data in policymaking, because maybe not all the use of data in the public sector or in public settings should be considered as data for policy. And also what I hope is that this initial work, which certainly has a lot of limitation because it was conducted, for example, by a single researcher, it could be further improved by one or two researchers, which will take the data that I will publish on Zenodo about the literature analysis, for example, and can better clarify and expand what I have done before. And at the same time, this could be a way to start an effort of making the data for policy field more clearly different from other fields which might be dealing with the same subject of data-driven innovation. And possibly what I'd like to suggest is mostly two things. The idea that it could be interesting to work on a human-centered perspective in using data for policy, and that seems to be encouraged by the fact that data ethics and data culture are so relevant. So rather than just discussing technology or regulation, we're discussing when is ethical to use data and in which context we can make data valuable for the public sector, which are not necessarily technological aspects. And also it could be useful to bring on the human-centered perspective by focusing on what appear to be an existing interest in citizen engagement. On the basis of that, I propose that the data-centric policymaking could be offered as a concept in contrast to the perhaps more diffuse idea of data-driven innovation in policymaking. To propose the concept of data-centric policymaking is a way for me to change a little bit the innovation perspective and also have some discussion about how this innovation perspective should be realized in data for policy. And by doing that, there is basically a subversion of perspective from a value in the output of using data in policymaking. So, for example, the idea that having data in policymaking process will equal to better policy decision, and that would be the value. And in contrast to that, the idea of data-centric policymaking propose to see the use of data in policy context, which might vary greatly depending by each situation. The value would be in changing the process of policymaking by including data in that process. So the perspective would be not in the output, a possible new decision, a possible new service, or a possible new technological application, but rather would be in the change in the process, because data could allow the inclusion of more actors, more expertise, another process of inquiry of public problems, and therefore the definition of policy problems. In this way, the innovation perspective would be in some way from the other side, from an internal side. And with that, I conclude my presentation. I hope it was interesting for you. I thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward for discussing these aspects at the Data for Policy Conference.